History doesn't always fall to swords. Sometimes, it sinks in salt water. One storm, one ship, one man dragged from the sea, and the England's fate was sealed. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's about how a single moment, a twist of fate on a raging sea, led to the fall of a kingdom and the birth of a legend built on a lie. In the year 1064, Harold Godwinson was not a king, but he was something far more dangerous. He was the strongest man in England, the Earl of Wessex, a warlord, a diplomat, a kingmaker, the real power behind the aging, childless King Edward the Confessor. Harold was the kind of man who didn't need a crown to command respect. His family, the Godwins, controlled nearly all of southern England. He was a seasoned warrior, a brilliant administrator, and immensely popular with the people. History would later blame him for losing England, but in 1064, he was its greatest protector. Then came the storm. Harold set sail on the English Channel. Why? The true reason is lost to time. Perhaps he was on a diplomatic mission. Maybe he was simply fishing or inspecting his coastal estates. Whatever the cause, the channel was merciless that day. Savage winds and the towering waves shattered his ship, driving the wreckage onto the shores of Bayeux, a small county in what is now northern France. He washed up on hostile land. The local ruler, Count Guy, immediately seized him. Under the ancient and the brutal laws of wrack, anything and anyone washed ashore belonged to the lord of that land. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England, was now property. His fine silks were replaced with chains, his grand hall replaced with a dark, cold dungeon. He was a prize, a political pawn of immense value, and the Count Guy intended to ransom him for a fortune. Word of this high-profile captive traveled south, across the border into Normandy. It reached the ears of its ambitious ruler, Duke William. William, later known as the Conqueror, was a distant cousin of King Edward and he held a flimsy claim to the English throne. He saw Harold's capture not as a problem, but as a golden opportunity. William did not rage or threaten. He calculated. He demanded Count Guy release Harold into his custody. Guy, intimidated by the powerful Duke, had little choice but to comply. So, Harold was rescued. He was brought to William's court in Rouen, but this was no more ordinary release. He was wrapped in a suffocating hospitality, a kindness as sharp and dangerous as a blade hidden in velvet. He was feasted, honored, and treated like a brother. William took Harold on a military campaign into neighboring Brittany. It was here, at the iconic Mount Saint Michel, that Harold's legendary strength was put on display. As Norman soldiers were sucked into the treacherous quicksand of the coast-known river, it was Harold who waded in, hauling two men to safety with his bare hands. He was a hero. The Norman court watched this display of power and charisma. They saw the man who held England in his palm. And William, ever the strategist, made his move. In a grand public ceremony, he presented Harold with weapons and armor. He had Harold place his hands on them, a symbolic gesture that everyone in the medieval world understood. It was an act of fealty. By accepting weapons from a lord, you are acknowledging him as your superior. You are becoming his man, his vassal. Harold, a guest who was still, in reality, a prisoner, had no more choice but to play along. He was trapped, but the real trap was yet to be sprung. William brought Harold to a place called Bayeux. Sir, in front of his court, he asked Harold to swear an oath to support William's claim to the English throne when King Edward finally died. The Norman accounts, written years later by the victors, paint a dramatic picture. They say Harold willingly placed his hands upon a covered table and swore the sacred vow. Only after he had sworn did William pull back the clause, revealing that Harold had unknowingly sworn upon the most holy relics in Normandy. The room, they say, fell silent, struck by the terrible solemnity of the moment. Harold was finally allowed to return to England. He had survived shipwreck, imprisonment, and William's gilded cage. 2 years passed. In January of 1066, King Edward the Confessor died without an hour. On his deathbed, Edward supposedly pointed to Harold and named him as his successor. This was all the justification the Witan needed. The Witan was England's council of great men, the lords and the bishops who had the ancient right to choose their king. They did not care about distant blood claims or oaths sworn on foreign soil. England did not inherit kings, it chose them. And they chose Harold. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England, not by a flimsy claim of blood, but by the law and the custom of his own land. Across the sea in Normandy, the news was met with calculated fury. William had his story. He had his justification for war. He wasn't just invading to seize a throne. He was launching a holy crusade to punish a perjurer, an oathbreaker who had defied God himself. This is the emotional core of the entire story of the oath. Was it real? Probably. Did Harold swear it? Almost certainly. But there was a huge problem the Normans conveniently ignored. An oath sworn under duress by a captive was legally and morally void. Everyone knew this. Harold was a prisoner, no matter how nicely he was treated. He had sworn with a sword at his throat, metaphorically speaking. And besides, he had no more crown to give away. The crown wasn't his to promise. It belonged to the English people, to be given by the Witan. But the truth didn't matter. The lie was more powerful. William's propaganda machine went into overdrive. He sent envoys to the Pope in Rome, telling the story of the sacred relics and the broken vow. The Pope, seeing a chance to extend his influence over the independent English Church, sided with William. He excommunicated Harold and sent William a papal benediction into battle. Suddenly, William wasn't an invader. He was the leader of a holy war. Harold wasn't a lawfully elected king. He was an enemy of God. 1066 was a brutal year for King Harold. Just as he prepared for William's invasion from the south, he was forced to march his army 200 miles north to face another threat, a massive Viking invasion led by the fearsome Harold Hardrada. Harold won a stunning, crushing victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, annihilating the Viking army. But there was no more time to celebrate. He received word that William had finally landed in the south. Exhausted, his army battered, Harold force-marched his men all the way back down the lengths of England. On October 14, 1066, he stood on a ridge near the small town of Hastings. His men, the English shield wall, stood firm for hours against wave after wave of Norman cavalry charges. They were tired, outnumbered, but they were holding. They were fighting for their king, their homes, and their way of life. Then, late in the day, a high-arching arrow flew from a Norman bow. It struck King Harold in the eye. He fell, and with him fell the spirit of the English army. The shield wall broke. England's last Anglo-Saxon king was dead. History, as they say, is written by the victors. William the Conqueror's story became the official story, the story of Harold the Oathbreaker. Today, nearly all scholars agree, Harold Godwinson was no more traitor. He was a legitimate king, chosen by the customs of his country, who fought and died defending it from two separate invasions. He was a man destroyed not just by an arrow, but by a masterful campaign of propaganda. Ally, blessed by the church and backed by swords, proved more powerful than the law. So, the next time you hear the story of 1066, remember the man on the hill. Remember the king who was undone by a storm, trapped by an oath, and ultimately buried by a lie. It makes you ask, how often does history crown the storyteller, and bury the lawful? One storm drowned an age. One oath never validly wrote the fate of a nation. If this story of England's forgotten king moved you, let us know by leaving a like. Subscribe for more dives into the hidden corners of the past. And as always, may history never be forgotten.